We begin the day with a question of trust. How much trust is there in public broadcasting? Here in Europe and also in the United States, the news media, which once enjoyed high levels of trust by the public, have seen those levels drop dramatically. And there are calls to defund and dismantle public broadcasters entirely. Consider what happened on Capitol Hill in Washington this week. The heads of PBS and NPR found themselves in the line of fire at a congressional hearing entitled Anti-American Airwaves. America's polarized politics were on display, Republicans accusing public broadcasters of political bias, and Democrats accusing Republicans of trying to shut down all voices that the party doesn't like. Take a listen.
Our job at PBS is to support our stations so that local stations can serve their communities. We've been proudly fulfilling our mission for nearly 60 years using the public airwaves and other technologies to help educate, engage, and inspire the American people.
NPR and PBS have increasingly become radical left-wing echo chambers for a narrow audience of mostly wealthy, white, urban liberals and progressives who generally look down on and judge rural America. For far too long, federal taxpayers have been forced to fund biased news. This needs to come to an end, and it needs to come to an end now.
So I'm sad to see that this once proud committee, the principal investigative committee in the House of Representatives, has now stooped to the lowest levels of partisanship and political theater to hold a hearing to go after the likes of Elmo and Cookie Monster and Arthur the Aardvark, all for the unforgivable sin of teaching the alphabet to low-income families' children and providing accessible local news and programming.
As we just saw, one of the loudest voices in that hearing was Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. The Republican firebrand went on the attack inside and outside of the hearing chamber, where she was involved in an extraordinary encounter with a British journalist. Now, it all started when the journalist posed a question about the Signal group chat scandal. And we felt that it was important to show this exchange in its entirety. This is a case, really, where the pictures do speak for themselves. Take a listen.
Yep. Anybody else?
Should the Defense Secretary...
What country are you? Wait, what country are you from?
From the UK.
Okay, we don't give a crap about your opinion and your reporting. Why don't you go back to your country where you have a major migrant problem?
Okay,
and you no. You should care about your own borders.
Do you care about American lives being put at risk?
Let me tell you something. Do you care about people from your country? What about all the women that are raped by migrants?
Do you care
no,
about...
by migrants. No, do you care? Okay, you're done.
Do you care about American lives being put at risk?
You know what? I don't care.
Service members fighting for your country.
I don't care about your fake news. Do you have a relevant question? Yeah, this is an American journalist. Thank you.
I'm an American, and I'd like to hear your answer to what she's asked.
I'm not answering her question because I don't care about her network. If you would like to ask, I can answer.
Any concerns whatsoever about the complete disregard of operational security from the top level of this administration?
You want to know about complete disregard about operational security? You should talk about the Biden administration and how they ripped our borders open to terrorist, cartel, child sex trafficking, human trafficking, and drug trafficking across our borders for 4 years. The Trump administration is doing a great job, and I stand by their statements. I stand by their statements. My comment to you is I'm thankful to President Trump that he is leading us out of wars, that he's ending the war in Ukraine, where American lives could have been killed if Joe Biden was still president today, whether he liked it or not. We're talking about NPR and PBS today. We're talking about fake news that was funded with federal funding from American taxpayers. That's what this is about today, not journalists from the UK that should care about their...
A journalist is being vilified for exposing failings.
What we just saw there, to be clear, that was a member of the U.S. Congress holding a press conference and telling a British journalist to basically disappear because we don't care about your network. Well, thankfully, an American journalist intervened, as you saw there. Now, this is certainly shocking. All of us here at DW and on the day, we have all been journalists in a foreign country at some point in our career. This kind of behavior and treatment by an elected official is never acceptable. I want to pull in now Seth Stern, Director of Advocacy at the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Seth, it's good to have you with us. You know, people around the world are watching this and they have to be asking, and I'll ask you, what is going on inside the U.S.?
Well, the state of press freedom inside the U.S. right now is rather dismal. The PBS and NPR saga is just one component of it. Yesterday, for example, news broke that a student who had written an op-ed in the Tufts University student newspaper criticizing Israel was abducted off of the street by masked federal agents, apparently is now in custody in Louisiana. The saga with the White House press correspondence with the Associated Press is well documented. And we've got a Federal Communications Commission that is going after not only NPR, PBS, but essentially all broadcasters that operate through FCC licenses that the president dislikes.
This hearing on anti-American airwaves, that was the title. I mean, can you give us the backstory of why the heads of PBS and NPR were asked to answer questions before a congressional committee this week?
There's been a longstanding push from the right to defund public media because, according to them, one, it is biased against them. Two, in today's media ecosystem with so many outlets out there, it's no longer a valid use of taxpayer funds. If I thought that this hearing was really about public media, it would be a different conversation. Public media, I think, is the low-hanging fruit because it is partially dependent on government funding. But the same arguments being used to attack public media are also simultaneously being used to attack private media, to attack all media, to attack the very concept of journalism as opposed to stenography for the administration. So I think this hearing was a bit of a stunt to give members of Congress footage to put on social media of their grilling NPR executives, but it's part of a far broader attack on the press.
Well, Seth, Republicans are accusing NPR of biased political reporting, and they point to the former NPR business editor, Yuri Berliner, who resigned last year after 25 years at NPR. He wrote a scathing letter on how NPR had lost America's trust, saying, and I'm quoting here, an open-minded spirit no longer exists within NPR, and now predictably, we don't have an audience that reflects America. So conservatives and moderates alike, don't they have a point when they say that their views are being ignored by public broadcasting?
Well, I'm not going to tell anybody whether their views are represented to the extent that they would like or not. I have a feeling that some of those people who see it that way are focused on a couple of NPR shows, a couple of PBS shows that they might not even watch in their entirety, but they might see clips of on social media. They might not be focused as much on the local journalism that NPR brings to areas across the country that are underserved by local media these days, so-called news deserts, where local papers might have been bought out and become a shell of themselves. And the only place people have to turn for reliable information is NPR. Yeah. To the extent that there is some built-in bias in the coverage, that's a separate conversation that can be addressed. It is not a reason to entirely defund and do away with such a core part of American media that people, particularly in rural areas that vote Republican, rely upon.
And, you know, if you take PBS and NPR out of the American media landscape, this is important for our viewers around the world to know, the remaining sources of news would basically be all for-profit commercial news operations, right?
There are also plenty of nonprofit outlets out there, but whether you're dependent on money from advertisers or you're dependent on money from donors, you're still dependent on some form of funding that is not guaranteed. And there are stories that need to be told that aren't necessarily profitable, that the market is not going to bring onto the airwaves, and that public broadcasting is necessary to tell. And some of these attacks on what these networks broadcast, that some of the members of Congress saw as bias, it isn't about political leanings. It isn't about Republican or Democrat. It's about even telling the story. For example, having stories about trans people. It's not biased to acknowledge that trans people exist in the United States. It had nothing to do with the editorial angle. It had to do with that content being there at all. And, that content might not be there if not for public media.
Yeah.
It is difficult to fund a private outlet that tells those stories, and maybe that's the goal.
Seth Stern with Freedom of the Press Foundation. Seth, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us tonight. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.